and welcome to Books from Your Therapist, a podcast where we talk to therapists and mental health practitioners about their mental health related book recommendations. By mixing book talk with mental health, we hope to open up the conversation around books your therapist may have suggested and make them more accessible.
This podcast is not a substitute for mental health care. It's for educational and entertainment purposes only. I'm Amanda Throckmorton, a marriage and family therapist in California.
And I'm Tara Kremen, and I work in the book industry in Toronto, in Canada. In this episode, we're talking with therapist Christine Droney. The books we discuss are Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go, A Modern Guide to Navigating Loss by Gina Moffa, LCSW, and When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi.
After nearly 2 decades of clinical experience in her own journey after losing her mother to cancer, Gina Moffa knows all too well how disorienting, painful, and lonely grief can be. In Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go, she offers a heartfelt, practical map through loss, one that can shift the pain of your grief even when things feel unpredictable and overwhelming.
At the age of 36, on the verge of completing a decade's worth of training as a neurosurgeon, Paul Kalanithi was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. One day he was a doctor treating the dying, and the next he was a patient struggling to live. When Breath Becomes Air is a profoundly moving memoir chronicling both his life and death.
This episode touches on something really important, which is grief and death and dying. But with that, we do cover themes that might be challenging for someone, especially if you're actively grieving. So always invite you to listen or take care of yourselves during this, or even come back if you need. So hi, Christine. Welcome to Books from Your Therapist.
And thank you for having me on. This is going to be fun and interesting and heavy, and hopefully, you guys will find it interesting.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a topic that we'll jump into, but we're sort of curious about who you are and your licensure, any parts of your identity you want to share with our listeners.
So I am a licensed clinical social worker. Came into this field later. So I am licensed in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Really came into this from my own life experience because we have there are 6 children in our family. We have a blended family, ages 42 to 28. And 5 of the 6 have von Willebrand's disease, which is a clotting disorder. It's autosomal. My husband also has it, so I'm fine with putting that out there. So I really became very involved in chronic illness, caregiving, stress management, everything that goes along with that. Became very interested in, how you're supported or not supported as a parent of someone with a chronic illness, and how you are a patient that is supported or not supported. So really spent most of my formative years, younger years, I've been with my husband 37 years, so I was 21. When I got into this adventure, and parenting and caring for 6, kids across my lifespan, blended, learning how the complexities of families, relationships, nuanced with dealing with, chronic illness. So got very just interested in this field. And then I'm originally from Belfast, from Northern Ireland. So grew up in the Troubles and the war, immigrated to the US as a 4th grader, which was very difficult, growing up in a war and going back and forth to a war. So just very interested in how we work, and the grief and loss piece is really part of who I am. So that's how I got started. I have a ton of different certifications, but I'm basically someone that loves this work.
You've had a very colorful, multifaceted life. Is all of those sort of experiences what inspired you to step into the therapy world?
I think what inspired me to start into the therapy world was the advocacy piece that, I've had a lot of visits in terms of public advocacy, but I think really looking at how chronic illness impacts a family, a community, and also how I was not supported, or how a patient is not supported. So therefore, my first love is palliative medicine. And I have a postmaster's in palliative medicine. And then it kind of went from there. So I consider myself working in the wheel of life. And I'm 59. So I've had different experiences. So my wheel of life is going to have turned more, if that makes sense.
What is your population that you work with? Is it mainly in that space, or who else do you work with as a therapist?
I love to also mentor other therapists as well. So I do a lot of that, but I really only work with 18 and above. So I'm limited to grief and loss, which is not just death, chronic illness, infertility is a large part of my population. Now, estrangement, which I don't love that word, but maybe bifurcated families. So anything that has to do with loss, loss is not just death. I would say I work in hard spaces.
Mm-hmm.
Hard spaces.
Heart spaces.
Hard
Yeah.
spaces, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing led to another. Someone would come to me for the grief piece of infertility. I don't know enough about infertility at that point, so I went and did a 10-month fellowship in infertility counseling so that I would have the confidence to also work with the infertility and the grief and loss. So that's why I say I work in the wheel of life, because grief brings you in, not necessarily because of death.
Sure. Sure.
I love that phrase, the wheel of life, because obviously it can seem like a downbeat thing to work in grief, or like a particularly hard thing. So the wheel of life is sort of makes it, yeah, cyclical and like maybe not
It is.
optimistic, but just an easier to consume phrase.
Yeah, I think when you work in transitions and the more life you live, whether you are a 20-year-old, a 25-year-old, whatever, things happen. A lot of the things are beyond our control and life happens. And I just think that's the wheel of life.
And just grief is touches everyone, right?
Mhm.
Most of us don't get through this life without experiencing some sort of loss to attachment. And to your point, it's not just death that we feel grief over.
Yeah, I think just using the word, it's universal.
Yeah.
So, and it's in all languages, all cultures, it touches everyone. So everyone will experience it on different levels. And it's important to have a grief literacy, which we're not a great grief literate society, even in terms of legislatively, as well. And I think that we need to be better at grief conversations. So I
Yeah.
always say, make sure your grief is welcome.
Hmm.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about some of your advocacy work that you do with lawmakers, because I noticed that as part of your website when I was doing some research on you. So, can you speak a little bit about this?
Yeah, so I got very interested due to, like I said, the 5 of the 6 children who are all adults having von Willebrand's disease. It's an expensive disease and it's really marginalized with women. It's a disease that is usually diagnosed later and they were diagnosed at birth. But in any event, I was very interested in the lack of insurance, right? Because it's a high cost disease.
Mm.
The marginalization of women, say with menorrhagia, having menstrual periods, there wasn't a lot of research dollars being put towards women. So you're going back probably 25, 30 years at this point. And really, when you're working with legislators, so I work with the National Hemophilia Foundation, which is now renamed the National Center for Bleeding Disorders. But you really have to put a person to the problem when you want to get something done legislatively. You have to really say, like, this is my experience. Otherwise, you're just a piece of legislation or a House resolution. So I would go with some of my children and without them to Washington, D.C., advocate, speak at national conferences, talk to other families. It's very grassroots, but it's important work and a lot of great things came out of it. And I met some of the best people in the world out of it as well.
That's awesome. I mean, that's how change happens, is like people like you just doing the advocacy work.
You know what? It's like you get a bill for $23,000 and the insurance company won't pay for it. You need medication right away. And you're like, what do you do? And the other piece is when you're working in the medical profession, my husband and I both in the medical profession, But also, most of the medical team, unless you're working with a social worker back then, and again, I'm talking, a few decades ago, nobody understood the psychosocial. You have those three pillars: psychological, psychosocial, and psychoeconomic. So here's your medicine, here's your treatment. Okay, but like my insurance won't cover it, or there's a lifetime cap. So that was that. It was the getting mad and getting angry that made me get involved. I think I'm a natural advocate, also growing up in Belfast, and all of that. So it was really, I would definitely say without the von Willebrands, I would not be having this conversation with you, and I would not be a therapist.
Well, your passion is so clear, and I can see what a fierce advocate you must be for your clients now, having had that earlier life experience. And I can, like, yeah, I can just feel your passion for this. So I can only imagine what it must be like to have you care and work with someone.
I think the thing is, right, your lived experience, not countertransference, just the lived experience of all of this. And when you are working in grief and loss, you're really companioning someone. So in my advocacy work, which I still do, I just spoke at the State House in Pennsylvania on infertility, because Pennsylvania is one of the few states in this, surrounding New York, New Jersey. They all have infertility benefits, but Pennsylvania does not. So I spoke with an embryologist, two embryologists, a fertility doc, on the psychosocial impacts on fertility on folks. And infertility is a diagnosis, but if you are also a same-sex couple looking to have a child, the out-of-pocket cost for everyone is astronomical, and it's dependent on what state that you live in here in terms of what's paid. So I went and spoke, and we had a lovely family that spoke as well on their lived experience. So you need to have that lived experience in order for legislators to see you. And I'm the person that can say, everyone else speaks to the science, and I can speak to, like, this is what these people, go through. Like, this is real life. I think that is so important to me, to be that voice of, like, this is someone's life, and that's the advocacy work that I love.
Well, we're going to be talking kind of mostly about grief today. I think you picked some books
Yeah.
that I hope listeners find really helpful. I mean, I think the first one, like we'll get into it, but they're both books that you can kind of pick up when you're ready or when you need them, as like we'll chat about grief being not a linear process at all. But before we jump into your very first book, is there anything else that you'd like to share about yourself, either professionally or personally?
No, I think I kind of covered it. I think as a therapist, the longer you live, the more that you see things too. So you see things through different lenses as you age, also in this field. And I just, like I said, I really, really feel very privileged to do what I do. I really feel it's an honor to journey with everyone.
Well, thank you for all the work that you have done, and I'm sure the work that you still have yet to do. And like I said, we can really feel like the passion come through, and it's really cool to, we connected on social media, so it's really great to see you and hear your voice and hear more about who you are as a person and just how you're contributing in such a big way to the world. I'm excited to jump into the first book. Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go by Gina Moffa, LCSW. Why did you pick this book?
Gina is a lovely therapist from New York City. She's a licensed clinical social worker. I started following her on Instagram, first of all, and then I picked up her book. I loved her little nuances. So she would put out beautiful pieces of her work, and I felt her to be very gentle on social media. And then I read her book, Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go. And then what I did after that is I listened to it. I use Audible, so whatever streaming platform. But I loved how Gina, through different chapters, pulls in mindfulness and the breath work
Mhm.
and just stopping and reflecting. So she really takes the grief and loss process and makes it, what I would say, gives it a vocabulary that's understandable. There's some really good books out there, but it's a clinical book, so I think any therapist that works in grief and loss should read it. But I also recommend it to the folks I see, and I will tell you, no matter what loss they're going through, everyone gets something from this book because of the language and the experiences and also the mindful piece. So I appreciate so much about this book. And she goes into costs like ambiguity and different losses. So she pulls in clinical work, but someone that is not a clinician, they need real life stuff that's going to help them. I also know that when you are a griever and you are grieving, many times you cannot read. Like cognitively, your body, you just cannot read. You're like, I don't know what I read. So that's where I love the audible piece. And I love the piece of the mindfulness that she brings into it. So I think it's a wonderful book. It's not a book of healing or how to get somewhere in the right time. It's a book for you that you can relate to in your way, in your own time, along with being clinically sound.
Yeah, I mean, she mentions for herself, right? This is the book that she needed. So she wrote it, right? And, she does this great job of weaving in like her personal experience alongside more of the clinical side. And, also thank you for naming the piece of when you're in this deep fog, sometimes for people of grief, like accessing a book doesn't feel like possible, right? We just actually talked about this. It's so funny, but I'm glad we're mentioning it again and how audiobooks are a great sort of avenue for someone in that fog. You touched on it a little bit, but can you give us a little bit of an overview of the book for listeners that haven't heard of it?
Gina's book is about when you're looking at grief and loss, there's a lot of books out there that are going to tell you how to do it, like how you're going to do this grief piece, right? And what you should do and how you should feel. And her book goes through, like, there's a chapter on different losses, different to name the losses, say, like, ambiguous loss, ambiguity, disenfranchised grief, things of that nature. She also pulls in, she went through a divorce. Her mother died while she's writing this book, right? So she's going through like the clinical aspects and explaining to you the neuroscience. So there's a lot of people don't understand the neuroscience behind grief. That's also Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor, a lot of her work at the University of Arizona. So in the book, she's pulling in neuroscience, which is evidence-based. And it's very helpful because it's like, oh my gosh, this makes sense. This is why my body feels like this, or this is why I can't read, or this is why I might be having a panic attack, or this is why I can't breathe right. So what she pulls in is the emotional piece and the cognitive piece. So she brings in the breath work, the nervous system, things like your appetite, your energy, fatigue, like how to handle that in a way that might make sense to you to support yourself. She also brings in platitudes. Say if you get divorced, well, you'll get married again, or the things people don't know what to say, and then how you may respond to it in a way that might be helpful, and also just validating that platitudes aren't great, right? That they're not really always helpful. So she brings in safety, emotional regulation, but a lot, I would say, of normal conversations and anger. It's okay to be angry. So she really talks about a lived grief experience of her own, but also as a clinician, and also talks about some of her patients or clients, depending on how you frame it, how she has worked with them. I think as you go through each chapter, I would go through it slowly and doing the breath work with her, understanding that does help me regulate my nervous system. And this does make sense if it's impacting me physically. There's psychological, physiology, all of that. So she brings in how it impacts your, like, cumulatively your whole life, but in a way that is understandable, not too textbooky.
You said the word safety there, and that jumped out at me because it definitely feels like a very safe book. Like I also listened to the audiobook, and the language is so gentle, and there's even parts where she's sort of like, "Hey, just checking in. Like, are you okay?" And I thought that was really like a thoughtful way of doing a book on a subject that can be so tough.
A lot of books, the person that's reading it will feel that they have to finish this grief process. So again, she talks about meaning making, continuing bonds. They're all the things that I know are important. And so I also think the book is a really wonderful book to give to a non-griever. So to give to someone that is trying to support a griever. along with like a therapist or, whomever supports grievers, but somebody in a family or a friendship that does not quite know what to do. It'll give you some language. So I think it can support not just the griever, it brings that grief literacy piece into it. So I really appreciate the book, and I appreciate that there's no timeline. You don't have to complete your grief process. Like there's no completion of this.
I'm smirking a little bit when you said finishing the grief process. Yeah,
Because
I
they're supposed
mean,
to tell you how to do it.
it's yeah, I think, I can't help but smile a little bit when you say that, because I think maybe there is an expectation, if someone hasn't experienced deep grief or loss in any form, that there's an end to it. And so, yeah, thanks for bringing that piece in. And I have to like mention my little like laugh, like, huh, if there were such a thing as fully completing it. And like another piece that stood out to me that you kind of just touched on was the body piece. I think that was something that really, I was like, I have not read a lot of grief books that spend this much time on the body. As a somatic psychotherapist, I was like, hell yeah, like let's talk about that. It's not just the brain fog or the thoughts, right? And she says grief is a full body experience. Can you say a little bit more about this for listeners?
Yes, I love Gina's book and how she goes into that. And I love Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor's book, The Grieving Brain, The Grieving Body. They're two separate books. And again, she's the researcher out of University of Arizona. I've trained with her as well. So I love the somatic piece. I love narrative therapy too, so there's so much in this book, but a lot of folks don't understand that they have a nervous system. They don't understand they have a limbic system. They don't understand how your GI system's impacted. They don't understand the fatigue. They don't understand, I may not want to eat. They don't understand how your body may not function in a way. They may not understand how your arms may feel heavy. And just in terms of getting in touch with your body. And that's where I love how she pulls in the mindfulness as a kind of a starter to start to integrate the whole person, not just the tearfulness, the emotion piece, right? That this does impact your entire system. It's a physiology. She speaks a lot to that. And I love to incorporate mindfulness into my practice. I actually work with a nurse practitioner, and this is all she does. So I often will like co-work with her. And so we bring a lot of somatic body work, integrating yoga and dance, and just sit with your body and do like a body scan. So really understanding that this is happening to you. This is a full on, when you are grieving, it's a full on experience. You get the works.
Yeah.
So she touches on all of that in the book.
Yeah, it really is a sort of a holistic look at what one's experience might be. And to your point, leaving it open for people to take the pieces that resonate or that feel true to their experience. Another piece she brought up was talking about emotional bypassing as something that prevents people from dealing with grief. Can you speak a little bit about this as well?
Well, because when she does that, she talks about the positivity of getting through based on what we say societal norm, that timeline piece that you're supposed to get through this by year one. I'm just saying that as an example. So by the time you've wrapped up all your touch points of anniversaries, holidays, you should really be good to go. It's interesting. I worked with one physician, and he was like, at 6 weeks, like, what, like, they don't have anxiety. I'm like, no, they have anxiety. No, it doesn't go like that. The emotional bypassing is the unfelt grief, how it resurfaces, right? And that it can resurface in anxiety, it can resurface in numbness, physical, emotional numbness. It can resurface again in physical symptoms. So that piece of not bypassing, trying to avoid that pain, and that expectation that you should be done at a certain amount of time.
Yeah, going back to the completing, the completing under like idea, right?
Like you should be a good student, get
Right,
your A+,
right.
and you should be good to go. And that's it.
Yeah.
I thought it was helpful also to understand why grief could suddenly hit you 5 years from now because you have been sort of bypassing it without realizing. Like, so looking at it from like the other angle, I thought that was sort of helpful language to put around something because I feel like I know you're saying with like the timeline on grief, people could beat themselves up around like, well, that happened a long time ago. Why am I only processing this now? And it was interesting to be able to identify like you've just been sort of you've just been moving your grief. It's not gone away.
And also think, just the education piece that in terms of, neurobiology, how you have those dendrites in ends of your neurons that are connected to the grief, right? So like, say you've had a loss and a death of a parent, or say you've had a pregnancy loss and you're like, why is this, what's happening to me now? Well, it could be a milestone. It could be a date, and it could bring you right back to that grief. And that's why it takes your breath away. And so that's, also Dr. William Worden's work out of Harvard, his tear model, which is important to understand that it's a grief squall too. It's like a snow squall. It can come out of nowhere at any time. So it's important to know, like, you're not finished.
You've talked about this a little bit, but this book outlines different types of grief, not just necessarily the immediate loss of someone or something close to you. So I'm just wondering if you could maybe explain what the author means by some of these terms. So we have anticipatory grief, ambiguous loss, disenfranchised grief, and then secondary loss.
So if you look at anticipatory grief, and we could twine that, with the other book too, the Paul's book, anticipatory grief is, say you have a parent with dementia, or you have a family member with dementia, you're grieving before a death happens, or something is coming up that is really hard for you. It's uncertainty, right? So you want to meet that anticipatory grief with some grace, some love, but it's grief that you feel before something happens. So again, if we talk about death, like a death anniversary, why do I feel so overwhelmed? Well, because I have a date approaching, and the date may not really impact me as much as the anticipation of the date. So that's where the anticipatory grief comes in. And what's really helpful with this book is giving language, giving a name to, like, okay, that's anticipatory grief. Okay, I can name that. It normalizes it. Ambiguous loss or ambiguous grief, it's so big. If you think of like the ocean and it's dark and uncertain, it can complicate your grief. It's comes usually without clarity, without any kind of closure. So if you think of the word ambiguity, I really don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty with it. So we'll find a lot of ambiguity with infertility, say, for instance, right? We'll also find a lot of ambiguity when we have fractured families. I don't like to use the word estrangement, but I'll use Dr. Pillemer's language with family fractures, because you don't know. There's no, there's not even, if you use the word closure, there's just no closure. I don't know what's going to happen. So ambiguous grief or loss is, I don't know what's happening. So it's ambiguity, which is difficult for people because humans want certainty.
Ambiguous loss is something that once I learned about what it was, I've read Pauline Boss's book. My therapist recommended it for me.
Yes.
And it puts words on things because sometimes there can be a little bit of you feel a bit of, maybe shame is the wrong word, but you sort of feel bad grieving something that isn't the immediate loss of someone because it's like, yeah, I think like you're saying, putting language around these other types of grief is really, really helpful because you can feel loss in many, many different ways.
And it's not prescriptive, right? Meaning how society feels it's prescriptive. So for instance, if you go through a divorce, you would have a lot of ambiguity because I kind of thought my life was going to be like this and now it's not. So even the loss of a job, so again, people ascribe grief to death, certainly, but there's a lot of ambiguity to life and there's a lot of ambiguity to grief. So again, having that word to say, I feel uncertain, I feel ambiguity. I feel like the ocean, the horizon, I can't see anything beyond that. There's nothing I can hold on to. So having that language is really important to be able to have that conversation. And also, even if you want to start writing things down or naming them, that narrative therapy piece is really helpful. So to understand that grief is not just grief, it comes in many shapes and forms, and it's unique to you.
I like the naming of this too because I think a lot of times people kind of go into the like the suffering Olympics of like, well, my loss or my feelings of grief around this breakup isn't as important as this person's death of their pet, right? It kind of goes, well, no, you're allowed to actually have your experience with this as well, even though it's a different experience of what you think about when you think about like a classic idea of grief.
Yeah, it's like not keeping score, like you didn't win the award. Everybody's allowed to have their own feelings and emotions and naming it. So ambiguity just leaves you with a lot of uncertainty.
I think this book is probably really valuable for anyone that's going through grief, or especially, as you were saying, for people that are trying to help somebody that's going through grief. But I'm curious with your kind of experience and like having read this book too, what advice that you would have for somebody who's really struggling with grief right now?
So, you know what? I think the best I use the word companioning when I am sitting with someone. So I try not to give advice, right? I'll provide resources. We'll talk through, try to break it down, like where are you now in your grief? Your grief is always welcome. And you want to be present with people that welcomes your grief, that kind of doesn't push it aside or doesn't minimize it or platitudes, all the things that, Gina talks about in the book. But I think I always start from where someone is, where, meeting someone where they are. So when I work with folks in my office, we really start with, how are you today? Something that we also work on, which is, folks tell me is so helpful, is when someone says to you, how are you doing today? A lot of people don't know what to say. Today, I feel today, right? Because that you just are going with today. And it also is a nice little boundary that also means like, if you don't, please don't ask me anything more than I want to tell you, right? Because that's all I can do. But it's really just meeting someone where they are, and it's going to change. It's that oscillation, it's that dual process model, of grief. Like you can be playing ping pong with yourself, going back from loss orientation to reorientation. When I'm companioning with someone, you can come in and have a really good day or feel like I'm kind of nailing this, I'm getting this, and then the next time something happens, right? Or you have a grief squall, or you get a piece of mail in the mail, or something happens, or a song, or whatever. So I think the best advice I can give is, first of all, go make sure whoever you're working with is competent in this field to work with, first of all. But also, you have to really sit and look at each person individually and see where they are in their grief journey. And it is a journey. So, and it doesn't end. It's like, it is truly building your life around the loss and figuring out, what does that look like for me? And you could be building and doing really well, and you could be like, everything just popped. I have to start over. So everything's individual.
I think that's such an important piece that she touches on so much is like everyone has their own experience. And it was interesting reading her piece about platitudes because
Yep.
I do agree and with her thoughts on that. And then I also was thinking about my own experience with grief and how sometimes those platitudes were kind of nice to lean into because I didn't feel like everyone was like worthy of hearing my grief or hearing my story. And so sometimes there was some relief to get the like, how's it going? Right? Like, hope you're doing okay. I'm like, great, thank you. Right. Whereas, and I think this is an important distinction, finding the people that can truly sit with you in your words companion and be curious about your experience without trying to lead you somewhere. Because grief in and of itself is such a harsh teacher, right? that it's, for me, the platitudes were a little bit like, oh, I can lean into this. Like, I know how to do this well, right?
Yeah. I think the platitudes, some people are usually just trying to find words. They don't know unless they have gone through it, and it's going to be different. How they go through it is going to be different than how you go through it, right? So I think it's okay, because people get upset with platitudes as well. And so we go through that usually people don't know what to say. So maybe if you say today I'm feeling, or today's a good day, or whatever, but it's important for you to have your own vocabulary, so that you can kind of set a boundary into, like, I don't really want to talk about it, or I do want to talk about it, and who are my safe people? Like, who are my listeners, not my talkers?
Yeah, I think that's really helpful advice for any listeners out there that are struggling. What do you hope that readers would take away from this book?
I hope readers take away that you can make your own vocabulary, you can make your own story. You are the writer of your story. You get to tell your own story through your own lens. And I think Gina's book, it gives you vocabulary. It's very nuanced. It's very gentle. It's clinical, so it's accurate. But I want readers to know that, like, this is also your journey, and it's a way to learn about yourself, because grief changes you. And it's okay to spend some time on your grief process, leaning into it, taking time away from it. You have to learn about yourself through this, and also try not to be siloed, meaning, if you have people that support you, for instance, if it's a parental loss or a sibling loss or something like that, go to your corners in grief, but come back to center, because everybody has a different relationship with that person. And it's okay to say, like you were saying, I don't have to win the grief prize because I was closest to this person. But I just think it gives you some language. And we are, again, we're getting better, but we're such a grief illiterate society that it's kind of like we celebrate birth, but death it's okay, meaning it's over. And we really need to celebrate our grieving process and give it and honor that piece of it, and say, you know what, I am a griever. It's a verb. Like, I'm actively doing something. And I think it's a way to honor your grieving process. And Gina's book gives you a lot of ability to do that through just the vocabulary and how she walks you through it. So that's why I like it. It's simple, it's clinical, it's clear, it's full of heart, and I just really like it. And I will tell you, everyone I've recommended it to just love it.
I'd love to move on to the second book that you've picked. This is the book of your choosing. So you chose When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi. Can you tell us why you picked this book?
So I wish I could tell you why I picked that book 10 years. It was probably 10 years ago. I think it's 10 years old. I think I saw this story on one of the morning shows. So Paul, just for anyone listening, Paul was a young neurosurgeon, also neuroscientist. So like that researcher and physician wrapped up into one. I'm assuming an MD, PhD, but I'm assuming that's what he was. He was going through life and ends up having some back pain and gets some x-rays and ends up having metastatic lung cancer. I remember when I first read the book. So I've read the book twice, and I listened to his friend read it on Audible. So I've listened to it throughout my 10 years of my life cycle. So in my 10 years, I've gotten different things out of it, because 10 years have passed, right? So I listened to it more from the palliative chronic illness and the end of life, because I love hospice work. I mean, who says that? But I do. I love hospice work. Comfort measures, comfort care, the narrative therapy piece where Paul's writing his own story, and then Lucy, his wife, finishes it. And then, I don't know how much you want me to go into right now, but, just all the things that they went through. So I'm also married to a critical care physician. And, when I think about now versus when I first read it, like how much of your life is dedicated to your craft as a neurosurgeon, and you give up a lot in order to be really good at what you do. And I can align that with my husband, how much like we all sacrifice time and his time to be really good at what he does for his patients. And then like Paul runs out of time. It was a theme in the book. Paul's very like didn't set out to be a physician, more the philosopher, the poet, the writer. And he writes about time, and then here he is running out of time in 22 months.
This was a very popular book and something that I've had on my digital bookshelf for quite a while, but I was a little bit intimidated by it because you obviously know it's a bit of a heart-wrenching story, but I hadn't realized his ambitions to be a writer, and I found his writing was like so good, and it's sort of more about his life as much as it is about his death. But his life story overall, it's like very impressive, and yeah, like coming to terms with your the end of your life is it's his writing is extremely moving about it. In your kind of experience, do you think that like writing about your life can be helpful for those that are nearing the end?
So I don't know if you've seen on my Instagram, but I write a lot about narrative therapy. So yes, I think
Oh,
it can be extremely helpful. So in Paul's case, I mean, he quotes many of the great writers, right, in his book. And then Lucy, of course, his wife, finishes it because he passes away, he dies. But yeah, so writing your own story gives you some agency over what's happening to you. It also is continuing bonds, right, for his daughter, Katie, who would probably be about 10 now. So, narrative therapy and writing your story gives you agency. It's your story. In Paul's case, he goes from talking about being in med school with the cadaver, like going through all those things, right? And it's interesting too, because even in his writing, he talks about being with a patient and doing a serious case, and then he pulls back to, oh, my ice cream was melting, and I, you know what I mean, like the here and now of like the trying to live his life in a here and now. This is pre-cancer to like really intense work that he does. But narrative therapy, I don't know how much you guys are familiar with that, but it's really, really a wonderful way for someone to take back their own story, to write, this is what happened to me, a way to memorialize themselves. I have worked with some patients at the end of life when I was on a palliative team, like writing letters to their children, transcribing letters. So, yeah, it's very powerful to write your story. Can everyone do it? I don't know. It's heavy. It's because, he was able to face his mortality because he knew so much. He had such a high health literacy. Interestingly, had a really interesting relationship with Emma, his oncologist, who was able to, even though he was a physician, she was able to give him information as she felt he could handle it, even though he was like, no, I want I want this information now. Yeah, I think it's very helpful. And we do a lot of narrative therapy in my practice. I run seminars. We're doing one in February with another woman with chalk art and psychodrama and narrative therapy. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity to say, everyone has a book, right? You have a book. Everybody has a book. Everyone has a story.
I really appreciate you bringing in the ice cream sandwich piece
Yeah.
because for me, that was really grounding while reading this because he's such a philosopher that as you're reading, it's like he's having this like awakened experience facing death, right? Which is so beautiful. And there's like the real life stuff of like stubbing your toe, like being stressed out about your ice cream sandwich that's melting while still giving care. So I appreciated that because it felt so human because he's highly intelligent and because he could go into that philosophy space so easily. It was like so good for me as a reader to be like, yes, and the day-to-day is still happening while he's experiencing this ambiguous grief in his life and fear of death. So I really appreciated those little pieces that made it feel very human. Do you recommend this book to people that you sit with in companion during the end of life for a loved one, or where are you on that?
I would say I would be careful, right, on who I would recommend the book to, because it could be, death is scary. I thought Paul and Lucy did a great job together, and I thought Paul did a really wonderful job in writing about coming to terms with death. Even at the end, do I get intubated? Do I not? That's where breath becomes air. You know what I mean? That the breath was what kept him alive, and the air was really what was killing him when he couldn't, get the lung cancer, couldn't get the air into his lungs. So I think I would be careful, but I would recommend this to any therapist or anyone working at end of life, working in hospice, working with patients with chronic terminal illness. I also found, having read it twice and listening to it once, I also found when they were going through their fertility piece, when they were deciding whether or not to have a child during this whole time, and like what would those continuing bonds look like. And then when Paul talked about the interview with the clinician, where they were completely like unaware, they didn't talk about him dying while they're talking about the sperm donation, right? And I thought to myself, from that piece, I feel like we've come a long way in 10 years, where I feel like we're more literate. I am, I would be more literate. But I think that you would have to be careful. I think it would be a wonderful book too for medical professionals to read, from the patient's perspective, on what it is like to die, and what it is like to actively die, and what it is like to actively live while you're actively dying. Because I think patients are marginalized, and it's about procedures, it's about sometimes keeping you alive, it's about medications. So I almost feel like it should be required reading in med school or nursing school. It really brings the humanity of the person and the finality of, like, what was that like for someone to go through all of that. And and then you bring in his parents and his siblings and Lucy and the colleagues, and he was experiencing deaths like a friend to suicide. Like, other people were also dying while he was thinking, well, I think I'm going to be the one. And so I think it's such an incredible read, and I think that's why I really just got so much out of that book, and I get so much every time, because it's humanity.
Yes, like very much so. And I think it's interesting to read his account of his life in the mental state that he was in towards his end of life. And you spoke a little bit about narrative therapy, which is great to talk about and explore. It makes me think about, for those of us that lose someone, what are ways that people can sort of memorialize someone that they've lost, and like, why is this important, right? Like, we hear the creating your own story and having it in your own words, but are there ways that you feel people can hold on to someone that's passed?
Well, yeah, I mean, and I think something just to touch on, I don't know if you guys have heard about the thin places or read about thin places. It's very Irish. It goes back to Celtic times. But so the thin places, to summarize it, it's, if you think of, like, I'm here and I'm here, and in between is a sheer piece of linen. The thin places are how close we are between life and death. It's a thin place. Thin places are that space between, the in between living and dying, right? And he does that really well. He doesn't talk about thin places like I do, but that's what's inferred. And I think that the continuing bonds of, like, will Katie remember me, when he talks about his baby, and how many times they refer to, like, especially at the end of his life, Katie being in the hospital bed, being placed next to him and not caring about the CPAP machine or the BiPAP machine. I mean, to keep the oxygen going in. So yeah, I mean, there's so many ways to continue your relationship with someone that has died. And I do a lot of that work in my practice. And it is continuing bonds, it is meaning making, it is, how do I keep that relationship with that person that's not, physically here? Some of it goes to, like, what is your grief belief? Where do you think that person is? Or there's so many, it's such an incredible place to work in. I cannot even begin to tell you that the stories I hear, it's like an honor. I just think death is a teacher. And remember, the other thing is, I don't know who said it. I think someone said it was Thomas Jefferson. I know Dave Matthews said it one time at a funeral. But death is for the living.
Yeah, I mean that's so beautiful, and also like and maybe a short plug for this book, Signs by Laurel and Jackson, which is depending on your belief around where someone goes, but it helps create, and to your point, like naming the thinness between life and death, and it helps people create ways to see their loved ones, and also an invitation to speak out loud to someone
Mhm.
that's passed, and the relationship still exists. It's just changed form, and you're allowed to do with that what you wish, depending on how you feel. And there's no right way to memorialize or speak to or remember someone. I know you mentioned that you've read this book a few times, and which I love the idea of like revisiting literature depending on where you're at in your life and how you relate to it differently. What did you take away from it this time that maybe was different than the first time you read?
So the first time I read it was, I was in palliative medicine, but I also had, being Irish Catholic, my parents each were one of 10 siblings. So my aunt had come to live with us in America when we moved here, and she died in her 50s. She was the first of the 10 to die of breast cancer. And so I really felt her when I first read the book because I went through this whole death process with her, right? And now myself going to be 60 in June, and now we're grandparents, and our children are married and they're older. I'm closer to the thin places. Like I think more about mortality and legacy and meaning making. And I want to make sure like I'm a good person, and I want to make sure I'm a kind person. I want to make sure I'm a good, like that I really value everyone that walks in my office. And you think more about legacy, more like Eric Erickson's, even going down to that. And so for me, I'm at a different time. I think about time. How do I value time? So again, Paul talked about that a lot. And time is non-negotiable for me. I'm really careful with my time. So I think I'm in a different place just with aging than I obviously was. And I'm also probably as a parent, a more calm because when you're trying to parent, you're going, it's like great can be, it's like I say, parenting is an Olympic sport and dangerous. It's really busy. So I think I'm in a time in my life of there's a lot of self-reflection. I have more time to think about the thin places and what that means for me. And I also have my mom has dementia. And so it's just I'm at a different place. And so life is more fragile and life is more meaningful because I can slow down and appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and thank you for going into the thin places with us today.
Yeah.
Right? Like I know we sort of said at the beginning, this can be a heavy topic that does impact all of us, yet as a society, we kind of shove it into the corner, and people don't have the tools or the knowledge on how to support another person or even themselves in it. And so thank you for going there with us today, and chatting with us about the books. Where can people find you online if they're interested in connecting with you, or supporting your work, or would like to work with you?
So you can just Google me. But you know what? I will tell you, I rarely accept new folks unless I go through like a vetting process, not because I'm so important, but because the work I do is so unique. Usually my referrals come from other folks or physicians or like a hospice and there are cases that I work with just because even if I don't have time, I'm going to find time because again, I'm not some superstar. I don't mean that at all ego driven, but this work is so incredibly rewarding, and it just gives you such an appreciation for the human spirit. And the other thing I want to say with while it's a heavy topic, humans they are so amazing.
Yeah.
People that can go through really hard times and it's something I always say to folks when I see them is you are going to find joy again. And they do not believe me. And inevitably they do, and they amaze me. They're like amazing. The human condition is unreal. That even when you go into heaviness in your life and really hard spaces and the thin places, that, you know, humans are amazing people and there's a lot of kindness out there. People are good.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been just amazing to dive in with you and hear about you and obviously highlight these two amazing books that paired so well together.
I appreciate both of you for being willing to talk about this heavy topic because I follow you and I love books and I'm like, wonder if anyone would talk about Paul's story. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to Books from Your Therapist. If you're interested in the books we talked about, we'll include links in our show notes. If you'd like to reach out to us with your own recommendations or a mental health practitioner or author interested in coming on to share, you can email us at booksfromyourtherapist@gmail.com.
If you're in California and interested in working with Amanda, you can find her at amandathrockmorton.com and follow us on socials. We are at Books From Your Therapist on Instagram, Threads, and TikTok. And you can follow me on Substack if you like at Tara Kremen.
Happy taking care of yourself through an ongoing grief process and finding the joy.
Happy going easy on yourself when you're going through a hard time.